Snow had a sound to it, the kind that filled the world when everything else had given up speaking. Evelyn Cross had learned to live inside that silence. Her cabin sat alone at the base of the ridge, where pines broke the wind and the creek slept beneath ice. She kept her lantern burning through most nights, not for warmth, but so she'd never forget there was still light somewhere. Inside, the air smelled of pine pitch and bread she never quite finished baking. Her hands were always busy, mending, chopping, sweeping, but her mind roamed elsewhere, to places where laughter once lived and died. The town below the ridge had not seen her in months. Some said she'd gone strange, that loneliness had sharpened her into something untouchable. They whispered she'd turned down a widower's offer, that she'd buried her faith with her husband, that maybe she'd buried the man herself. Evelyn didn't bother to defend what she no longer cared to keep. Gossip was its own weather. It came, raged, then froze over. All she needed was her quiet, her horse, and the sound of snow pressing against the roof like a slow heartbeat. One evening while she was chopping wood, she heard the first thing that didn't belong to winter. A gunshot, faint and far. Then another, closer. The axe froze in her hands. For a moment, only her breath moved, visible and trembling. The valley swallowed sound, but not that one. She turned toward the ridge, the forest heavy with dusk. Then came the rhythm of hoofbeats, fast, desperate, breaking the stillness apart. Evelyn's pulse followed their pace. She moved inside, latched the door, dimmed her lamp. Through the frost-glazed window, she saw movement. 2 riders, dark against the snow. They dismounted clumsily, one nearly falling. Both men were enormous, built like the mountain had carved them, and sent them down to remind the world what strength once meant. They wore worn leather and furs, hair thick and long, eyes like night storms. Their horses panted steam into the air. One man, broad shoulders, hair tied back with a strip of hide, leaned against her fence post, clutching his side. The other turned toward her cabin window, and spoke in a language she didn't know, but somehow understood by its urgency. Evelyn stayed still, one hand hovering near the rifle she kept by the hearth. A knock came, heavy but measured. "Go away," she said softly, though her heart wanted her voice to sound stronger. The reply came low, tired, and in accented English. "We mean no harm." She hesitated. The wind clawed at the door like an impatient spirit. Then another sound, blood coughing through a throat. She opened the door a crack. The taller one looked up. Snow clung to his lashes. His face was rough, jaw lined with old scars, yet his eyes held the strange stillness of a man who'd seen too much to be cruel. The other leaned heavily on him, half conscious. "Please," the tall one said. "He will die." Evelyn stared at the wound, a dark patch spreading across the man's coat. In her mind, she saw the grave she'd dug years ago, the dirt under her nails, the priest who'd refused to say her husband's name aloud because he'd been Apache by blood. She saw the way the townsfolk had looked at her since. Her hand trembled on the door latch, not from cold but memory. "Inside," she murmured finally, stepping back. They carried the wounded man in, careful not to knock over her chair or crush her small table. Blood stained the floorboards. Evelyn fetched bandages and the small tin of whiskey she kept for nights when the loneliness bit too deep. The taller man pressed his cousin down, murmuring words that sounded like prayer or guilt. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "Soldiers," he said, his voice hoarse. "Wrong place, wrong time." She didn't ask more. She had learned that some questions only invited ghosts. As she poured whiskey over the wound, the man gasped and gripped her wrist, but not to stop her. He looked up, eyes burning through pain. "Thank you," he said. Evelyn nodded. "Lie still." Hours passed. The wind thrashed at the walls, but the fire burned low and steady. The taller man stood near it, silent, his presence almost too large for her small cabin. His name, he told her finally, was Tasunk. His cousin, Nakai. Both from the southern plains. "They'll come looking," he said quietly. Evelyn met his gaze. "For you?" He nodded once. "For him. For both." She looked toward the window. Snow thickened against the glass, a curtain drawn by heaven itself. "No one comes up this far in weather like this." Tsunk's expression didn't change. They will. He moved to the door, peered out, then turned back. We leave when the storm eases. But the storm didn't ease. It worsened. By dawn, the snow had buried the fence and erased their tracks. Evelyn brewed coffee that smelled of cedar smoke and silence. Nakai slept feverishly. Tsunk paced the cabin like a caged animal, then knelt by the hearth, running a hand through the ash. She watched him quietly. How his hands were careful, how his movements had the weight of someone who understood both gentleness and violence. When he finally looked up, his voice was softer. You live alone here. Evelyn nodded. Your husband? Dead, she said before he could finish. Years now. He studied her, not out of curiosity, but understanding. And you stayed. She met his gaze. Someone has to. The quiet stretched between them until the sound of hooves shattered it. Distant but growing. Tsunk's head snapped toward the window. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Through the whiteness, a lantern's glow flickered. More followed. 6, maybe 7 riders. Sheriff, Tsunk muttered. Evelyn moved to the window. You can't fight them. He didn't answer, only reached for his rifle. Then he turned toward her, his voice calm but final. If they find us here, they'll hang you for harboring us. I'll say nothing. He shook his head. They won't ask. They'll shoot. He stepped closer. So close she could smell smoke and iron on his skin. When they knock, you say I'm your husband. Her breath caught. What? Act like you're mine. The words hit like a spark in dry tinder. She stared at him, heart pounding. They'll never believe it. They will if you do, he said simply. Then his eyes softened, the stormlight flickering across his face. Please. Before she could answer, the first knock struck the door, loud, demanding. Evelyn's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. Tsunk moved behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the other ready on the rifle. Open up. A voice barked. Sheriff Pike. She unlatched the door. Cold air flooded in. The sheriff stood there with 2 deputies, his hat rimmed with frost. His gaze swept the cabin, then lingered on her face. Morning, Miss Cross, he said. You alone up here? Evelyn forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Not today. Pike's eyes narrowed. That so? Tsunk stepped forward into the firelight. The sheriff's hand went to his revolver, but Evelyn spoke first, voice steady though her pulse roared. My husband, she said. He came home before the storm. For a long breath, no one moved. Then Pike laughed once, short and disbelieving. Didn't know you'd taken to marrying ghosts. Tsunk's gaze didn't waver. She's no ghost, he said quietly. She's the reason I still breathe. The room froze. Outside, snow kept falling, soft, endless, uncaring. Pike studied them both, then spat into the drift. If I find you're lying, Miss Cross, I'll see this place burned to the ground. He turned his horse and rode off into the storm. Evelyn closed the door, her back pressed against it, breath shaking loose from her chest. The fire crackled like a heartbeat she didn't trust. Tsunk was still by the window, watching the fading shapes vanish into snow. When he finally turned to her, his eyes held something unreadable, something between apology and promise. Outside, thunder rolled far away, the kind that didn't belong to winter. Inside, the air trembled as if the storm had entered with them. Evelyn met his gaze, her voice barely a whisper. What happens when they come back? Tsunk's answer was quiet, almost tender. Then you'll have to decide if you still want to act like you're mine. Morning broke through the storm like a fragile promise. The cabin stood half buried in snow, smoke trailing thinly from the chimney, as if even the fire inside hesitated to announce its warmth. Evelyn woke to silence, the kind that feels heavy, listening for what comes next. For a moment, she thought the night before had been a fever dream. Then she saw the second pair of boots near the door, large and still wet, and the folded blanket on the floor where Tsunk had slept sitting upright, his rifle across his knees. He looked different in daylight, less like a shadow, more like something carved out of the land itself. His hair, once black as storm clouds, glinted faintly bronze where sunlight touched it. Evelyn watched him quietly as she poured water into the kettle. When the floor creaked beneath her, he lifted his head. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. He shrugged. "Storm was loud." "So was your pacing," she replied, and there was the faintest ghost of humor in her voice. It startled them both. Nakai stirred under the quilt, groaning. His fever had broken, color returning to his face. Evelyn checked his bandage. The bleeding had stopped. "You'll live," she murmured. The younger man smiled faintly, voice hoarse. "Then maybe I owe you mine." Evelyn didn't answer. She poured coffee for Tsunk, her hand steady even as she felt his gaze follow her every movement. It wasn't watchful in a threatening way. It was as if he was memorizing the way light moved over her, the way her fingers trembled before she caught herself. Outside, the valley had turned into a white sea. Pines bent low, and the world seemed to breathe in slow, shivering rhythms. Inside the cabin, something warmer had begun to shift. The silence between them no longer felt like distance, it felt like truce. By midday, Tsunk was outside splitting wood. His movements were measured, graceful, like someone who had learned discipline through survival. Evelyn watched through the window, unsure why her chest tightened at the sight. The sound of his axe cutting through frozen logs broke the air like steady heartbeat. When he noticed her watching, he didn't smile, but there was acknowledgement in his eyes. Two exiles seeing each other across the same loneliness. Later, as she swept the floor, a noise echoed from below the hill. Hooves again. Evelyn froze. Tsunk looked up from his work, eyes narrowing. She stepped outside, her shawl pulled tight. Down the ridge came 3 riders. Sheriff Pike rode in front, his coat dark against the snow. "Inside," Tsunk said quietly, taking up his rifle. "No," she replied. "They'll see the smoke anyway." She met him at the door, her hand brushing his arm. An accident, but the touch lingered. "Let me talk first." When Pike dismounted, his expression carried that sharp blend of authority and curiosity that had always unsettled her. "Morning again, Miss Cross," he called, his tone too polite to be harmless. "Heard tell you had visitors." Evelyn held her ground. Word travels fast for a snowed-in town. "Some folks don't like the idea of Apaches hiding up here. You understand." He tilted his head, studying her face. "You got nothing to hide, right?" Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. "You searched yesterday." "Maybe I didn't look hard enough." He took a step closer. "You sure he's your husband?" Before she could speak, Tsunk appeared in the doorway. His presence was calm, deliberate, the kind that silenced men without raising a weapon. Pike's hand went to his gun again, but Tsunk only said, "You came to threaten a woman twice in 2 days. Must be lonely work." The deputies chuckled uneasily. Pike's jaw tensed. "Watch your mouth, Chief." Evelyn stepped between them, her voice sharper than she intended. "Sheriff, please. He's done nothing wrong." "That's what they all say." Pike looked at her a long moment, then turned to spit into the snow. "If I hear more talk, I'll come back with a warrant." He climbed onto his horse and rode off, his men following. Evelyn's hands shook when she shut the door. She leaned against it, breath uneven. Tsunk stood a few paces away, watching her. Not with pity, but a quiet respect. "You lied for us again," he said. Her eyes flashed. "You think I did it for you?" He tilted his head. "Then for who?" She didn't answer. The truth was too tangled. Maybe it was pride, or defiance, or something nameless that woke when he looked at her that way. That night, as wind clawed at the roof, Tsunk worked silently to fix the broken latch on her door. Evelyn sat by the fire, mending one of his torn coats. The domestic stillness unsettled her. It felt like the life she'd once imagined before the world hardened. When he finished, he lingered near her chair. "You shouldn't have to stand against them alone," he said softly. She looked up. "I've done it before." He knelt beside the fire, eyes low. "You shouldn't have had to." The words landed heavier than either expected. She studied his face, the scar above his temple, the faint burn across his palm, the kindness hidden under silence. He wasn't the savage the town whispered about. He was something steadier, more wounded, more alive. "Why were you running?" she asked finally. Tsunk didn't look at her. "We took a child from a traitor. He killed her mother, said the law wouldn't care. We cared. Now they call us killers." Evelyn swallowed. The simplicity of it, the moral turned upside down by power, cut deep. "And the child?" "Safe," he said. "With her grandfather." The firelight trembled between them. Evelyn reached out without thinking, fingers brushing his forearm. "You did right." He met her eyes then, a long, unguarded look. The air between them thickened, charged not with romance but recognition, the kind that only forms between two people who've both lost their faith in mercy. Before either could speak again, Nakai groaned from his bedroll. "They're close," he murmured. His voice was distant, fever returning. "I heard the drums. The soldiers, 3 miles south." Tsunk rose instantly, his body all readiness. "You're sure?" Nakai nodded weakly. "They'll come by dawn." Evelyn stood. "You can't ride through that storm. You'll freeze before they find you." Tsunk looked toward the window, where the wind carved white scars through the night. "Better to freeze than hang." "No," she said, firmer than she felt. "You'll stay until the storm passes." He turned to her, expression unreadable. "You'd risk your life for us?" "Maybe I already have," she whispered. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, heavy with the weight of something unspoken, unformed. The wind outside wailed like the valley itself was listening. Evelyn moved closer to the fire. "If they come, we'll hide you." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then I'll trust you." His voice was low, solemn, a vow disguised as gratitude. When she looked up, he was still watching her, eyes glinting like embers refusing to die. Something in her chest gave way, a thaw she didn't expect, slow and terrifying. Outside, a lone horse neighed from the dark. The sound came from the ridge, too distant to be friendly, too near to ignore. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "They're closer than you think," she murmured. Tsunk moved to the window, snowlight glancing off his jaw. "Then the storm isn't our only enemy," he said. In the stillness that followed, she realized the fire's glow had dimmed, and with it, the illusion of safety. Somewhere beyond the valley, men were coming, and this time, mercy would not be part of the storm. The third night came heavy with silence, that kind that makes the walls feel alive listening. The storm had not eased. Instead, it buried the valley in white so deep the horizon itself seemed erased. Evelyn moved like a ghost through the cabin, feeding the fire, wringing cloth, watching over Nakai's shallow breathing. The fever made him speak nonsense. Names, places, songs that faded like smoke. Tsunk sat at his side, never sleeping, eyes hollow with worry. There was something in his stillness that frightened her, a man too used to waiting for loss. When she placed a cup of broth in his hands, he said quietly, "You shouldn't care for us." She ignored him, straightening the blanket. "And if I didn't?" He met her gaze. "Then you'd still have peace." Evelyn gave a short, sad laugh. "Peace is just another kind of emptiness, Tsunk. I've had enough of it to know." He looked at her as though memorizing every word, but before he could answer, the wind outside dropped to a breathless pause, the sound before a door opens. They both turned. A faint rhythm echoed from down the valley. Hooves, deliberate and slow. Evelyn's spine went rigid. "They found us," Tsunk murmured. He rose, moving like shadow, checking his rifle, glancing through the frost-laced window. A lantern glowed far below, winding through the trees like an omen. Evelyn felt her pulse throb in her throat. "You can't fight them here," she whispered. He didn't answer. He went to the hearth, lifted the floor plank, revealing the narrow crawl space beneath. "We can hide there until they pass." Evelyn stared. "You'll suffocate in there." "Not before they burn the cabin," he replied evenly. His calm terrified her more than panic would have. Then, faintly, another sound carried through the night, a man's voice calling her name. "Miss Cross." Her stomach turned. "Sheriff Pike." Tsunk's expression hardened. "He brings more men?" I don't know, she said, though her voice betrayed her dread. He won't believe me again. He doesn't need to, Sunk muttered. He just needs an excuse. He crouched beside Nakai, who stirred, muttering something about smoke and drums. Evelyn knelt, touching the young man's forehead. You can't move him in this storm. Sunk hesitated, torn. She saw it. The same instinct that had kept him alive, now at war with the part that refused to leave someone behind. Outside, the doorframe rattled under a hard knock. Miss Cross. Pike's voice came again, colder this time. Open up before I open it for you. Evelyn turned to Sunk. If I hide you, they'll find him. If I don't, they'll hang you both. His hand brushed her arm, grounding her. You've done enough. She shook her head, heart pounding. I'm not done yet. He looked at her, searching for something. Fear, perhaps, but found resolve instead. Then, without another word, he climbed into the crawl space, pulling the plank above him. Evelyn spread a rug across it just as the door burst open. Snow swept in first, then Pike, his face chiseled from suspicion. 2 deputies followed, stamping their boots, rifles raised. Well, Pike said, scanning the room. Smells like company. Evelyn forced a steady tone. I told you before. I'm alone. He stepped closer. Then who's that? Nakai had begun to stir, groaning softly. Evelyn moved quickly, kneeling beside him. A traveler. Sick. He came begging for shelter. Pike crouched, eyes narrowing. Looks Indian to me. Half, she said. Like my husband was. And the law doesn't forbid mercy. The sheriff smiled without warmth. Depends who you're merciful to. He rose, circling her small cabin, tapping walls with the butt of his gun. Funny how your husband never showed his face in town. Almost like he wasn't real. Evelyn's throat tightened, but she met his gaze. He was real enough to die. The words hit Pike harder than she expected. For a moment, something human flickered in his eyes, then vanished. He gestured to a deputy. Check the back. I want to see if our good lady's telling the truth. The man moved toward the corner where the rug covered the crawl space. Evelyn's breath stopped. Her palms went cold. Then, in a heartbeat, she moved, spilling the kettle of boiling water across the floor. The deputy jumped back, cursing. Careful! She cried. You'll burn through the wood. The chaos bought her seconds. She knelt, scrubbing the mess, heart thundering so loud she could barely hear. When she looked up again, Pike was watching her. Not angry, but suspicious in a quieter, deadlier way. You've grown bold, Miss Cross, he said. I've grown tired, she replied. His eyes narrowed, then drifted toward Nakai. You say he's half. Then where's his papers? Where's his name? She lifted her chin. I don't need papers to help a dying man. He stepped close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath. You do if he's wanted for murder. Evelyn's hand twitched, ready to slap him or collapse, she couldn't tell which. But then a faint sound cut through the air, a muffled creak beneath the floorboard. Pike froze. His head tilted. What was that? Evelyn forced a laugh that cracked like thin ice. The wind, she said. This cabin's older than your badge. He didn't move for several breaths. The deputies waited, shifting uneasily. Finally, Pike exhaled through his nose, turning toward the door. We'll be back when the storm clears. If I find you harboring anyone, Miss Cross. You'll hang me, she finished. You've said that before. Pike's smirk faltered. Don't tempt me. Then they were gone, boots crunching through snow, fading into distance. Evelyn stood motionless until she was sure the sound had died completely. Only then did she fall to her knees, pushing the rug aside. To Sunk, she whispered. The plank lifted, and his eyes appeared in the dark, calm, steady, alive. She exhaled so hard it broke into a laugh that almost turned to sobbing. He climbed out, dusted snow from his hair, and looked at her in silence. You could have let him find me, he said quietly. I could have, she replied, meeting his eyes. But I didn't. They stood close, firelight flickering between them like a heartbeat. The storm outside roared again, reclaiming the night. "Why risk everything for strangers?" he asked. Evelyn turned toward the window. "Maybe because I stopped believing anyone would do the same for me." He said nothing, but she felt his gaze, soft as it was heavy. Then Nakai coughed behind them, weak but alive. Tsunk moved to him, hand pressing his shoulder. Evelyn watched. Something in that simple gesture made her chest ache. Later, as the wind died to a low hum, she sat by the fire, exhaustion sinking deep. Tsunk joined her, silent, his presence filling the room without need for words. He handed her a cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. "You've seen war," she said quietly. He nodded. "Everyone sees war. Some just name it different." "Then what's this?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "Maybe the part after, when you decide what kind of person it left you." The flames danced across his face, and she saw it then. The grief buried beneath his calm, the quiet rage of someone who'd been hunted too long. And she saw herself in it, mirrored pain, mirrored pride. Snow pressed harder against the windows, whispering against the glass like a warning. Evelyn shivered though the fire burned hot. "They'll come back," she said. "I know. You'll run again." He looked at her then, voice low. "Not unless you tell me to." She opened her mouth, but words refused to come. Outside, a distant horn echoed, a soldier's signal. Not close yet, but near enough to chill the blood. Tsunk stood, eyes fixed on the sound. "They've found the trail," he said. Evelyn rose beside him, the firelight catching in her hair like flame. "Then you'll need more than hiding this time." He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something close to fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for her. When the horn sounded again, closer now, Evelyn reached for his hand. It was rough, calloused, trembling just slightly. "Then we fight," she whispered. Tsunk's grip tightened, his voice a rough vow. "Together." And outside, in the heart of the white storm, the echo of drums began to rise. Slow, steady, and coming closer. The wind carried the smell of smoke before the first torch appeared. Evelyn felt it through the floorboards. A pulse in the earth, steady and deliberate. Night had fallen deep, yet the storm's light lingered, painting the snow in blue fire. Tsunk stood by the window, rifle slung low, his body half shadow, half flame. Nakai lay behind them, still pale but awake, the fever-broken though weakness clung to him like frost. Outside, a dozen figures emerged from the dark, their shapes warping in the blizzard's breath. Lanterns bobbed. Boots crunched. Pike's voice rang out, sharp as a blade. "Miss Cross. You've got one chance to hand them over." Evelyn's throat tightened. Tsunk's jaw flexed, silent but ready. She whispered, "If you shoot, they'll burn the cabin. You'll die for nothing." He didn't move. "Then I'll die standing." Her hand touched his arm, gentle, trembling. "And I'll die beside you." For the first time, he looked at her not as a stranger or savior, but as something he couldn't name. The wind moaned through the cracks, carrying Pike's next words. "They're killers, Miss Cross. Murderers. You know what harboring them means." She lifted her chin. "It means I remember what mercy feels like." Her voice carried through the night, thin but unwavering. The men outside shifted, muttering. Even the fire seemed to hesitate, caught between defiance and fear. Tsunk moved to the door, opening it just enough for snow to slash his face. "You want blood?" he called out. "Come earn it." Gunfire split the silence. The first bullet shattered a lantern. Light scattered in shards of flame. Evelyn screamed and pulled him back as glass exploded across the floor. Smoke rolled in, thick and acrid. "Get down!" he shouted, dragging her behind the hearth. The cabin shook under the barrage, wood splintering, fire spitting sparks across the floorboards. Evelyn pressed a cloth to her mouth, choking. Nakai tried to rise, coughing blood. "They'll set it ablaze," he rasped. Tsunk's eyes scanned the room. "The back door," he said. "We take the ridge." Evelyn grabbed his satchel, heart thundering. "There's no cover out there. Better than burning here." The next shot punched through the wall inches from her head. Tsunk flung open the rear door. A gust of snow and smoke swallowed them. Evelyn stumbled into the night, boots sinking deep. The air burned her lungs. The storm hissed like a living thing. Behind them, the cabin glowed faintly orange, embers beginning to bloom. They half-carried Nakai toward the ridge, the slope steep and slick. Each breath came out as steam, each step a war. Tsunk led, eyes fixed on the distant line of trees. Evelyn slipped once, catching herself on his arm. He didn't speak, but his hand steadied her, firm, grounding, alive. When they reached the ridge, they collapsed behind a fallen pine. Below them, Pike's men spread out, torches cutting through the snow like serpents of fire. Evelyn shivered violently. Tsunk tore his coat in half, wrapping part around her shoulders. "You'll freeze," she protested. "I've known colder," he said. For a few precious breaths they rested, 3 souls bound by chance and choice. The snow softened around them, muting the world to a strange calm. Evelyn watched the smoke rise from her cabin, curling into the sky like a prayer undone. "That was my home," she whispered. Tsunk looked toward the flames. "Homes can burn," he said. "But people remember the warmth." His words sank deep, quiet and tender. She turned to him, tears freezing on her lashes. "What happens when this ends? When they kill you, or when you leave?" He didn't answer right away. The storm howled down the valley like a beast let loose. "Then you remember this," he said softly. "That you weren't alone." Below them, a shot cracked. A bullet struck the pine, showering bark across their faces. Pike's voice echoed up the hill. "You can't hide forever. There's no law for your kind here." Tsunk's jaw set. He rose, sighting down his rifle. Evelyn grabbed his arm. "Don't. If you shoot him, there's no going back." His eyes flicked to hers, filled with something fierce and breaking. "There's no back to go to." He fired. The echo rolled through the valley, swallowed by wind. One torch fell. Shouts followed. Men scattering, firing blindly into the storm. Evelyn ducked, dragging Nakai lower. Smoke mixed with snow until the world became a blur of gray and fire. When the gunfire ceased, Tsunk crouched beside her again. His breath came ragged, frost clinging to his lashes. "We have to move," he said. "They'll flank us." Nakai shook his head weakly. "No, you go. I'll slow you down." Evelyn grabbed his hand. "No one gets left." Tsunk looked between them, torn, then nodded once. "We make for the river. It's frozen, too dangerous for horses." The descent was brutal. Snow blinded them. Branches clawed their faces. Evelyn's skirt tore, her fingers numb. Twice she stumbled, Tsunk pulling her upright without a word. Each time his hand lingered just a moment longer than needed, as if to make sure she was real. At the river, they paused. The ice gleamed like glass under the moonlight. Evelyn hesitated, hearing the faint groan beneath. "It won't hold." Tsunk looked back. Torches were closing in again. "It has to." He stepped out first, testing the surface. It creaked but held. Nakai followed, leaning on him. Evelyn took a breath and stepped after, every crack echoing through her bones. Halfway across, the ice split with a sound like thunder. Evelyn gasped as her leg plunged into freezing water. Tsunk lunged, catching her by the arm. The shock of cold hit like knives. She gasped, fighting to breathe. "Let go." "Never," he said through clenched teeth, hauling her free. His grip left bruises of life on her skin. Together they stumbled to the opposite bank, collapsing in the snow. For a long time, none of them spoke. The night had gone deathly still again, save for the distant calls of men searching, fading farther away. The storm was easing. Only their breath remained, curling like smoke in the air. Evelyn turned to Tsunk. His face was pale beneath the soot, his lips split, his coat soaked through. Yet his eyes glowed with something unbroken. "You saved me," she whispered. He shook his head. "You saved me first." Nakai tried to smile, his voice weak but steady. "You both talk too much." They laughed, ragged, small but real. It felt like the first sound of life after burial. When dawn began to gray the edges of the horizon, the storm finally broke. The valley below lay quiet, blanketed in smoke and ruin. Evelyn looked down, her old life gone, nothing left but ashes and breath. "What now?" she asked. Sunk looked toward the far mountains. "We keep walking until no one remembers our names." She nodded, eyes glistening. "And if I don't want to forget?" He turned to her then, the rising light catching his face. "Then remember this," he said softly. "Not the fear. Not the fire. Just this, snow and breath, and the way your heart sounds when it refuses to stop." The wind rose again, carrying the faint toll of a church bell from the distant town. Slow, mournful, and final. Evelyn shivered, but not from cold. Somewhere deep within, something had shifted. A wound closing, a beginning disguised as loss. As they turned to walk toward the mountains, Sunk glanced back once more. Figures were moving through the trees again. Tiny in the distance, relentless. Evelyn followed his gaze. "They're coming." He nodded. "Then the storm isn't over." And together, they vanished into the white, leaving only footprints that the wind began, patiently, to erase.